Today's headline is Buried the Four Bears. The subheadline says, they were circus animals and unused to the ways of the world. This article was originally reported in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on October 20th. It says, one day, several months ago, Jake Banks entertained the loafers at the grocery store across corners with a remarkable tale of four bears that he had seen in the South Mountains. He said they played ball and performed various gymnastic feats on a wild grapevine. Before he had concluded, Banks was called away. Last Sunday, however, he returned, and on Monday evening, he related the following. Well, he said, you know there was an old she-bear and three half-grown cubs in the traveling animal circus that I saw in Crow Nest Hills, but it wasn't for several weeks that they exhibited in my region again, and then it was their farewell appearance. I had moved my camp several miles eastward on the second hill and was doing a little nosing around for some city chaps. I had a mighty close call with a lot of wildcats, run foul of several other dangerous animals, and once got lost in a big cave, but I'm off the track that leads to the bear family. Well, one morning I got out just at daybreak and struck across to a place I had heard of about 2 miles away. After looking it over, I worked around in a circular direction toward my camp. Late in the afternoon, when I was still an hour's tramp from my tent, I struck a place where there were some of the biggest trees I've ever seen in my life. They were a kind of fir, went up 40 or 50 feet before there were any limbs. I stood and looked around in amazement. It was one of the prettiest places I had ever stumbled upon in the mountains. The grass was short and very thick, and the few boulders that lay scattered around were covered with moss. It struck me that this would be a good place for my camp. I had some crackers and cheese in my pocket, and I sat down on the nearest rock and began to eat them. I was very tired and might have been half dozing when all of a sudden I was startled by a sharp crack. It raised me to my feet mighty quick, I tell you. I looked carefully around but did not see anything suspicious. 5 minutes passed, and I had settled back on the rock and was half asleep again when there was a second crack, and as I raised my head, I saw something dark and large drop to the ground from a small hickory tree that grew about 150 feet away. Of course, it could only be a bear or wildcat, and as I wasn't all fired and anxious to make the intimate acquaintance of either, except over the muzzle of a gun, I slid gently from the rock to the ground and waited. In a minute or so, I heard a sort of noise back of where I had seen the dark animal drop, and there from the limb of a large hickory, I saw swinging 3 half-grown bears. I knew instantly it was my gymnastic family, and putting aside the rifle, I fixed myself and prepared to watch them. They went through pretty much the antics I told you about the last time, swinging like you've seen fellows at the circus. Presently they came down the tree and came slowly across the grass toward me. The little wind that was blowing was from them to me, or they certainly would have scented me. When they came to 2 big rocks, about 100 feet from where I lay, they climbed up and sat down. All this time I was wondering where the old she-bear could be. She had always watched her children mightily close. Now they were alone and seemed to be having a fine time. Presently they got off the rocks and one went out a little distance and dropped on all fours. Then the other 2 ran toward him on their hind feet and putting their hands on his back vaulted over him. Then they went down likewise and the first cub jumped over them. They were playing leapfrog as well as any boys I ever saw, and they were enjoying it. In the various changes of position in the game, one of the bears landed near a tree that had evidently been blown over several years before. It had been one of the biggest of the big fellows that grew around the place, and it was still well preserved. The smaller boughs had rotted away, but the trunk and large limbs were black and hard. Instead of fixing himself for his brother's jumps, he remained on his hind feet, looking hard at the fallen fir. The other cubs kept on jumping, and when they reached him, they also began to watch the tree. I took a hand in the looking now myself, but although I had mighty fair eyes, I couldn't see a thing out of the ordinary. At last, the cub seemed satisfied, and with a grunt the largest made at the tree, followed by his brothers. They began to work around the trunk 50 feet from the butt, and in a moment I saw something like a cloud rise from the ground and circle around their heads. Now I understood the situation. They had found a bee's nest and were for stealing the honey. They would put their paws into the cavity in the tree, bring out great fists of honey, and greedily lick it off with their tongues. If there is one thing you know that bears like, it is honey, and they will submit to any quantity of pain to get it. Meanwhile, the bees were not idle, you just bet. There must have been 1,000,000 of them, and they went at the bears like mad. The hum of their wings sounded like a storm, and I concluded that instead of one nest, the cubs had struck a dozen. The bear's thick hair and hide protected them, but occasionally a bee got in a good thrust, and the cub would jump around and slash at himself with his paws. The honey was going fast, and I was thinking of pulling quietly away toward my camp, when one of the cubs suddenly climbed about 40 feet into the air and with a roar began to batter himself on the ear. Evidently a bee had gotten into his head and stung him, and the pain was awful. Instead of becoming quiet, he got worse, and turning on his little enemies, he began to beat them down with his paws. Meantime, his brothers were getting in their work with the honey and didn't seem to notice the one in pain. When they did, however, they ceased their robbery and looked at him with broad grins on their faces. Suddenly, each gave a howl and then began the same performance that the first bear had gone through. I laughed until I was tired at those three cubs knocking the bees right and left. In 10 minutes, they had so used up the bees that comparatively few of them were left. The exercise seemed to relieve some of the pain, and the cubs went to work on the honey once more. The hole was evidently pretty large, and one of the cubs got up on the tree and stuck his paw into it and handed some honey out to his brothers. I was about to sneak for camp again when I saw this fellow jump off the tree and make rapidly toward the big butt. I stopped a moment to watch him. If I hadn't, you would have never heard this story, and the fate of the bear family would have been lost in obscurity. The other two bears followed right after their brother, and just as they reached the end of the tree, the one ahead grunted 2 or 3 times, and each cub went down on all fours, and the leader peered around the trunk. In a moment he grunted again, and the two in the rear made a double quick march for the other end of the tree. Here they broke from the limbs 3 good-sized clubs, and returned to their brother. He took one of the sticks, and the trio instantly doubled the end of the trunk, and the clubs went up and came down upon the ground with a thump. Before I had time to wonder what they were at, I heard a buzzing sound that meant but one thing: rattlesnakes. One rattle after another went off, and it was plain that the cubs had struck a big nest of them. The fight was now on in great shape. The bears were slashing away at the ground like crazy and jumping back and forward to avoid the snakes. I couldn't see well from my position, and I crept slowly around toward the rocks where the bears had first seated themselves. I got there all properly, and then things were very plain. The ground was covered with the rattlers, and the cubs had a pretty big job on their hands. Every time a club came down, it hit a snake, but the buzzing still went on, and from out of the hollow butt of the tree came rattler after rattler who would go right on to work on the invaders. As long as the bears could keep the snakes far enough away to avoid the full force of their fangs, there was little danger of the poison getting beyond their thick hair. The only hope the rattlers had to win the fight was to strike some of the more exposed places like the head. The cubs were in the fight for good, and they went at it in a way that pleased me mightily. I sort of looked upon these cubs as my particular friends, and had I suspected how the business would end, I would have taken a hand myself. For 10 minutes, the bears' clubs went up and down as regular as the ticker of that clock there. If the snakes had gotten any poison, it hadn't showed itself. I noticed that no more of the varmints came out of the tree, and presently one of the cubs threw down his club and walked back a short distance along the tree and sat down with his back against it. His 2 brothers, after stirring through the heap of dead snakes, followed him and leaned against the tree, the 3 in a row. They grunted and motioned and pointed toward the rattlers. While I was looking on at this conversation, I saw an immense rattler come rapidly from the tree, raise its head and look around until it got range of the cubs. Then it turned and glided into the nest. In a moment, 3 rattlers wiggled out and disappeared behind the tree. I presumed they were leaving for a less dangerous place, and I was about to cut past the cubs and return to my camp when I saw first one, then another, and then the 3rd snake come cautiously up the side of the fallen pine and coil themselves, one behind each bear. Their heads swung from side to side. Brr went the rattles. The fangs shot out, and each cub was struck just back of the ear. The way those youngsters got awake and right about it was mighty funny. As their muzzles faced the snakes, the varmint struck again, and the poison went straight into the nose of each bear. And before they could recover themselves, they got another dose, and then the snakes dropped from the tree and struck as rapidly as they could swing their heads. With a howl of anger or pain, the cubs stooped, and seizing the snakes in their paws, they whirled them through the air and smashed the life out of them against the tree. But the poison was getting in its work. The cubs seemed perfectly crazy. They ran up and down, beating themselves with their paws, lay down and rolled over and over, howled and growled. While they were rolling on the ground, they all 3 managed to bump into one another. That settled it. They were clear daft with pain or something, and in an instant, a glorious free fight was on the carpet. They went at one another with awful roars, and the blood began to run, and the fur and skin came off in great pieces. I have seen some pretty rough and tumble scrimmages, but this was the king of the heap. It was a slaughter, and it almost made me sick. I turned away my head. When I looked again, one cub was flat on the ground, and the other 2 were staggering around in a circle, waving their paws in agony. Then, like a flash, the end came. Down they went like logs, and the rattler's poison worked its end. Just then I heard a slight noise, and I almost jumped out of my jacket as I saw the old she-bear come racing across toward her dead children. Once she got to them, she went down on all fours and sniffed each cub all over. Then with a peculiar roar, she sat down beside the tree and rested her head in her paws. I was in a fix. There was the old she-bear with her 3 dead cubs. If she could see me, she would make things so hot that I would be killed. She would be sure to think that I had killed her cubs, so I concluded to keep very quiet. I waited for an hour. Still the bear had not moved. Half an hour longer, the old girl was in exactly the same position. The sun had gone down and it was rapidly growing dark. I thought it was time to get away. I moved quietly out from the rocks and started toward the nearest tree. There was no difficulty. I got back to camp, cooked supper, and turned in. In the morning, I went straight to the big trees to get some of the rattles. When I got there, I could hardly believe my eyes. Just in exactly the same position was the she-bear, and at her feet still lay the bodies of her cubs. I walked straight out into the opening with my gun ready. The bear didn't move. I went closer and closer, and then I saw it all. The old bear was dead. I looked her carefully over. Her body bore no mark. There was only one way to explain it. She had died of a broken heart. I buried their carcasses beside the fallen pine, and the next day I brought a headboard and planted it over the graves. On it I had cut, "Here lies the gymnastical bear family, a mother and 3 cubs. Peace to their ashes." This story comes from the great state of New York, being reported in the New York Sun of October 21st, 1894. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we'll see you next time on Americana Archives.